Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Bangkok University and to our event this afternoon. First of all, I would like to invite our Dr. Thanu Gulachon, President of Bangkok University, to deliver his welcome remarks for this special event. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Thanu Gulachon.
Distinguished guests, faculty, students, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Bangkok University and to this special lecture, The Economics of Peace, by a 2003 Nobel laureate in economics, Professor Clive Granger. Bangkok University and the International Peace Foundation co-host today's great event. We feel very privileged and honored to be a part of the second and final event series, Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace, which are hosted in various national and international organizations, institutions, enterprises in Thailand between December 2004 and April 2005. As we look towards the world today, its people, the challenges that we all face in our times, a call goes out to all who have within them the seeds of peace, knowing that we all have common needs and common goals in a rich diversity of expression. I firmly believe that education goes hand in hand with peace. Our children, our future generation should be encouraged to partake in the dialogues of peace. We should encourage them to learn to be open-minded, to be considerate, to listen, and learn to live and understand people around them. Then the bridges will allow us to cross and to reach to other people. Without much further ado, I would like officially declare the opening of this great event, a special lecture entitled The Economics of Peace by our very distinguished speaker, Professor Clive Granger. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Next, may I invite Mr. Uwe Morawetz, the chairman of the International Peace Foundation, please, to give his introductory remarks and a brief information about the International Peace Foundation.
Self-confidence, independence, freedom, respect, open-mindedness, tolerance, curiosity, attentiveness, and humor are some of the basic qualities of the Thai way. These are also basic qualities and principles for dialogue. Dialogue is the first step towards peace. Increasing ethnic, political, religious, and social conflicts and the helplessness to respond to them without further increasing the spiral of violence show us daily peace is not given. It has to be constantly learned, created, and experienced anew. Peace is not a passive state. Peace is a process which needs time and the participation of everyone. Above all, peace begins with education. The seeds of peace need to be planted in schools, in universities, in the new generation. This is why the International Peace Foundation cooperates with 76 institutions, including 23 schools and universities nationwide, as well as with the Ministry of Science and Technology, the Education Society of Thailand, the Science Society of Thailand, and UNESCO, among others. It emphasizes the importance of Thailand's education and scientific community, which interacts with 28 Nobel laureates for peace, physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and economics, who have been and will be visiting Thailand as keynote speakers in the Bridges event series. The International Peace Foundation, with its base in Vienna, has not opened a branch or established another Thai foundation, but facilitates and hosts the 250 Bridges events between November 2003 and April 2005 with Thai partners. In doing so, the foundation acts as an independent pool, offering its network of organizations, Nobel laureates, artists and leaders in all parts of society to support peace and education projects of existing Thai institutions with contacts and knowledge. ผู้ได้รับรางวัลโนเบลหลายท่านที่ได้มารวมกิจกรรมในภาคแรกได้ให้คำสัญญาว่าจะกลับมาประเทศไทยเป็นประจำเพื่อร่วมวิจัยและดำเนินโครงการร่วมกับสถาบันต่างๆในประเทศไทยรวมทั้งเชื่อมความสัมพันธ์และความร่วมมือที่จะขยายตัวในวงกว้างทั่วโลกเพื่อให้เกิดความเข้าใจระหว่างกันผ่านการสารเสวนาโดยความเชื่อมั่นในตนเองความเคารพซึ่งกันและกันความใจกว้างความอดทนและความมุ่งมั่นในฐานะที่เป็นชาวภาพการจัดโครงการสารสัมพันธ์สู่สันติวัฒนธรรมประเทศไทยนับเป็นผู้สร้างแรงบันดาลใจอย่างมากให้กับทุกคนที่ได้รู้สึกซาบซึ้งและจะมีโอกาสได้สัมผัสกับภูมิปัญญาในวิถีไทยในโอกาสนี้ผมขอขอบคุณดร.ธานูบุญลชนอธิการบดีมหาวิทยาลัยกรุงเทพและพันธมิตรทุกท่านสำหรับความร่วมมืออันน่าประทับใจในงานจัดงานนี้ I would like to express my deepest gratitude and thanks also to Dr. Prasan Trairat Warakun, who came today. He's the president of Kasikorn Thai, Kasikorn Bank. And without their help, this whole series would not be possible. So may I thank especially Dr. Prasan. I'm of course also especially grateful to Professor Clive Granger, who came to Thailand without any honorarium to support our efforts, and I now look forward to his keynote speech and to his important contribution to build bridges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uwe. Thank you. Before we proceed with our lecture today, I would like to introduce our guest lecturer by reading his biography shortly. Professor Clive Granger is a professor of economics at the University of California in San Diego. He was awarded the 2003 Nobel Prize in Economic Science, shared with Professor Robert Ingle, for the development of methods of analyzing economic time series with common trends, known as co-integration. Born in Swansea, Wales, Professor Granger earned his joint BA degree in economics and mathematics from Nottingham University in 1955, followed by a PhD in statistics in 1959. After he obtained a Harkness Fellowship at Princeton University, New Jersey, and became Professor of Economics and Statistics at Nottingham University, he went to the University of California, San Diego, to take a professorship in the Economics Department, where he has remained and taken part in building up the econometrics section to become one of the finest in the world. From the 1960s, Professor Granger has been one of the most influential scholars in time series economics. Such time series show the development of GDP, stock prices, interest rates. Methods developed by Professor Granger are applied in the analysis of relations between wealth and consumption, exchange rates and price levels, and short and long-term interest rates. It is said that it is virtually impossible to do empirical work in time series economics without using his methods. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Clive Granger.
Hope I can talk from here, so I can use the projector. I'd like to thank the organizers of this meeting, the Peace Foundation and everyone from Bangkok University. It's a nice occasion. When one gets a Nobel Prize, one gets a lot of invitations to do things immediately, to give talks and attend conferences and go everywhere. One very first invitation I received was from the Peace Foundation to give a talk in Bangkok, Thailand. And I thought, that sounds great. I'd never been there, I should do that. And it was decided to come a year later from the invitation. And I offered a title of Economics of Peace, a topic that always interested me. I'd never worked on the topic. It struck me as a very interesting, important area. And I had a whole year to work on it, so that was that time, and a great idea. And now I have to go and deliver the talk that I've tried to work on over these last 12 months. But the last 12 months have been very busy, and so I haven't spent all my 12 months working on this one area. As an academic, what you do when you start a new topic is to read the literature. And I thought this was going to be very simple. There'd be a large literature on economics of peace. It turned out there's almost nothing. There's a huge literature on the economics of war. There's a very large literature on the economics of disarmament, the change from war to peace. And even from the Cold War to the post-Cold War period, there was a lot of discussion about that. The benefits, the so-called peace benefit, how big that will be and how quickly it will occur. But virtually nothing on the economics of peace. There's one very famous booklet by Lord Keynes, a very famous British economist, called The Economics of Peace, but in fact it's not about the general topic, it's about a very special aspect of it concerning the request by the victors of World War I for repayments by the losers of World War I, Germany. And Lord Keynes was saying that you shouldn't ask for too much from Germany because you'll ruin their economy. That will have very bad effects, and I'll discuss that later. So there wasn't much literature, and I had to then sit down and think and talk to my friends and worry about how to proceed. So this talk really is not a conclusion. It's not the end of the research in this area. Hopefully it's the beginning. I hope to initiate lots of thoughts about how to enter this topic of economics of peace. Just to convince you that economics is not irrelevant in this whole area, we could think of questions that, or topics where peace had an impact on, where economics had an impact on important areas. So the first one is one is mentioned, where at the end of World War I, and I'll come back to that later. The other two cases are where the US production, because the US is such a dominant economy, and has been for some time, US production was so large that the people that it was fighting against was overwhelmed by that production. And the first case was in World War II, where the German U-boats were attacking the shipping across the Atlantic. And the United States' reaction to that was to build new ships so quickly that the U-boats couldn't sink enough ships to stop the flow of materials across the Atlantic. And that seems a very unpleasant way to phrase that, but in fact that won the Battle of the Atlantic, that and some other features. And the other situation was the end of the Cold War, when it said that US production was so enormous and inventive in new armament that Russia just could not keep up with the Cold War and sort of gave up. That was the end of communism. You could argue that economic aspects of the world has big effects on things like peace and war. I need to define some things. And I should first say that I think virtually everybody would prefer peace to war. I can make that assumption. Maybe a few people in the world who prefer war to peace, but let's assume that they're a tiny minority. And I could define peace as just not war. So I can define peace as the typical situation which most people will expect themselves to be in, and war is the untypical, the unlikely situation. And that's why I think most of the world always thinks about war. War is a surprise, an unfortunate event, a short happening, and then you go back to the regular situation, which is peace. So peace is not war. Now, I'm just going to talk about three types of war. The first that I would call complete war. And that's a war which the whole nation is involved in the war. Everybody's affected, virtually. An example of the world wars and a civil war would be a complete war. So in Europe, Britain's had a civil war, France had a civil war, Russia's had a civil war, the United States had a civil war. These are wars which are devastating wars. Everyone is involved, and the whole nation loses from it. I should apologize for the fact that my upbringing has been in Europe and the United States. I visited Australia, New Zealand, and some other places to some extent. So most of my examples are going to come from that background. My examples will be mostly European, United States centered. And that's just because that's what I know about. And I try and talk about what I know about rather than things I don't know about. I don't always succeed in that, but I try that. I define a partial war as a war in which just part of the nation is involved, but most people are not involved. And so I think of things where you send your military off to do the war for you in some other location. So a very nice example is what the British call the Falklands War. With the Falklands War halfway around, almost totally halfway around the world, the people in Britain had no connection to that war at all. They read about the newspaper and saw TV accounts, and the Navy and Army, Air Force went off to fight the war for you. And a lot of wars like that, which are partial wars, they can be expensive, they can be devastating some certain groups of people, but generally the whole war, people are not involved. And I'll show you some examples in a second. I'm not going to talk about terrorism in this talk, except mention it very briefly. That's a whole big topic on its own. I'm not going to define that as in this war way of saying it. So war is a standard situation, and you typically don't justify peace on economic grounds. Your preference for peace is not because you're going to have a good economy. You prefer peace typically because the society is going to be better for being in peace rather than in war. There is stability. Your family's better off. There's less risk to you and your family. And that's where the preferences come from. Your society can be more stable. You can generate arts and music and things better in peacetime than wartime. So we don't justify peace on economic grounds, but nevertheless we can ask the question, what difference is there between a peace economy and a war economy? Excuse me. Now, to give you some just data to think about. These are a listing of some of the wars that took place in the 20th century. And there's some few more down here to which will come in a minute. So I start with the Great War, 1914, which involved mostly France, Germany, and Britain. The United States arrived a little bit later. It ended in 1919. That was called, at that point, the Great War, or also was called the War to End All Wars. You'll see from the listing there it didn't succeed in that objective. Now, it wasn't called World War I until there was a World War II, which was 1939. And now the Great War is called World War I. And so henceforth I'll describe them as World War I and World War II. So World War II started in 1939 and ended in 1945. I just put two economic events in this period, with the great stock market crash of 1929, which was preceded the Great Depression, and then the Marshall Plan in 1948-52, which was a plan to try and help the European countries to recover from the Second World War. So these two wars were both complete wars. Everybody in the nation involved were totally impacted by the war. Then, since then, there have been a lot of wars. We've got Korea, Bay of Pigs, which was Cuba, Vietnam, First Iraq War, Afghanistan, Second Iraq War. And I've not put in Panama and Suez and some other wars that took place. So these are all, from the viewpoint of the United States, partial wars, because the United States just sent their army or their troops to go and fight the war for them. A lot of people were involved in the war, but in fact it was still a distant war. Now, of course, if you're a Korean, this is a complete war. So how you typify war depends on who you are. What's interesting to me is that since 1945, the end of the World War II, many countries in the world have not been involved in wars. Most European countries have not had a war since 1945. Many Asian countries are not involved in a war since 1945. And so 60 years of peace is in fact quite a typical situation for many people, many countries. Just some countries have been involved in a lot of wars. The United States have been involved in 6 partial wars, Britain has been involved in 4 partial wars, and so on. But that's just certain countries are involved in a lot of wars, other countries are involved in just a few. Most are involved in none. And so the spread of war and peace is quite different across different nations. And perhaps we can ask questions later, and not necessarily here, about why certain nations do more wars than others, and what are the economic effects of that. Now, to get some economics into this, I'm going to take a piece of a pure, simplistic economic theory and think of the same economy, but one time it's in a period of war, other times it's a period of peace. I'm not talking about a particular economy, just thinking abstract. And ask yourself the question, how are they different economically in the two situations? It's called comparative statics, the phrase we use in economics. This is theory, remember. And what I've done then is write down for different concepts how they look under the different war situations: complete war, partial war, and peacetime. And when there's a little arrow, It means that this situation is the same one that the arrow points to. So the first line, for example, says social structure. And social structure means how does society behave, not necessarily economic society, but society generally, behave in these different cases. And so, again, I'm thinking about the Europeans in the United States. Under complete wars, society changes a lot. The rules that used to behold before the war break down during the war and therefore follow through after the war. I'm thinking about things like women working in different situations. So before the war, women would not work in certain cases, like in a factory. During the war, they'd have to work in factories because the factory needed workers. After the war, because they'd had experience working in factories and showed they were good at it, they still had some employment in factories. So there was a social breakdown because of the war. In a partial war, in a peacetime, there's much less of that kind of change of social structure. Typically, there's a very slow evolution of that sort of change. And partial wars are more like peacetime, and this category. Let's think of unemployment. Unemployment is typically very low in a complete war. The government employs everybody. All young men are off in the army, fighting or whatever. They're all employed. And so there's no unemployment. And in fact, a lot of women are employed because they have to, again, talk about the European case, to take the place of the men who are off doing other things. And so unemployment is typically very low in a complete war. In a peacetime, unemployment could be anything. It can be low or it can be extremely high in economies, depending just on the way the economy is going. It just happens on the situation in the economy. But typically, unemployment would be much higher in peace. And partial wars, I've just put a question mark, it's not very clear. How about risk levels? It's very important in the economy to ask how risky is the economy, because a lot of decisions depend on the level of risk. And that's reflected by the size of interest rates. If an economy is risky, the interest rates will be high. If the economy is not very risky, interest rates will be low. Well, in complete wars, risk level is high, interest rates are typically high. In peacetime, risk is lower, and typically interest rates are lower. But there can be periods where interest rates are high for other reasons, business cycle reasons and things. And so we can go down this list and for different concepts, ask the question, how does the peace economy look different from the war economy? And they're quite different. Exchange rates, for example, are very volatile in a complete war, and all kinds of things can happen under peacetime. Government debt is typically increasing in a complete war, become huge, where on the whole it's more under control in a peacetime, and so on. So we can see differences in theory between complete war periods and peacetime periods. We'd expect the two things to be different. The one thing that is obvious is that this risk level is going to be the major driving difference. Typically, we find that the partial war periods look more like peace in terms of the economy. A partial war, unless it's very big, will not affect the economy in the bad ways that a complete war does. Now that's all theory, but what happens when we look... Sorry, one thing. One thing that risk does is change the type of investment you do. If you have projects, let's go back one step. if you think about the value of an investment, and in one investment you get the money out today, another one you get the value out tomorrow or next year. So suppose I either get $50 today or $50 in a year's time. You typically prefer to get the money today rather than a year's time. Because in a year's time, all kinds of things could have happened. You know, money in the pocket is worth more than the money in the future. So you can ask the question, how much extra would I have to be paid in a year's time to be equal to the same to money now? So if I'm either given $50 now, what would I have to be paid in a year's time to equal $50 now? And that's called the discount rate, that makes that difference. The discount rate depends on interest rates. And what this little diagram is saying that if the discount rate is low, then you can go quite a long way into the future and you're not changing the value of money very much. So if interest rate is low, whether you get money next year or 3 years out, is not that much difference. Whereas if the interest rate is very high, your discount rate is cutting it off very quickly. So the value of money in 3 years' time is worth a lot less than the value now or in 1 year's time. What does that do to investments? Well, often when you are in industry, say, you have the choice of a number of possible projects, some of which pay off a lot in the short run, but not much in the long run. Other which pay off steadily over a long period. When the discount rates are high, the first project is a good investment, but the second one is a bad investment. You don't get your money back. When discount rates are low, both investments can be perfectly adequate investments. They give you similar sort of amounts back. So when discount rates are low, when interest rates are low, when risk is low, you have a richer class of investments to put into your portfolio or into your investment list. And so we can think about investing into things that take a long time to pay us back. We get more stability in our investment portfolio. We can make longer run decisions. To a family in a low risk period, you can think about longer run decisions. You could buy a house or whatever. In high risk periods, you're typically going to maximize your utility or pleasure in the very short run. And that's the difference between war and peace. In peace, you can have more stability, you're going to make longer run decisions, you can build better society because you can take a longer view of the world. In wartime, you've got to get your thing out quickly, your money back quickly. And so you go to a different class of projects. This is just a piece of mathematics which says the same thing. I'm not going to talk about it, unless you insist. That's all theory, but what about reality? If we look at the real economy, the actual economy, I should say, and I've only done it for the United States, it'd be interesting to do it for other economies. We might try and do a project on this later on. We didn't find much relationship in the United States between volatility or interest rates, or things like stock markets, and the partial wars. So basically, a quick look at the data did not suggest that partial wars were making a big difference to discounts. But there's a colleague of mine at another campus of University of California at Riverside, Dr. Marcel Chauvet, and she was using a very advanced technique called Markov switching models, and she did find relationships between volatility of changes of GDP and the start of certain partial wars. What she found was that there was an increased level of risk at the start of these wars, but not during the war. In other words, the thing became risky at the beginning when people got used to the idea of there being a new war starting off. But then once the war was going on for a few months, people reverted back to like a peacetime economy. Their reactions were passive. That didn't work for the Second Gulf War, because at the beginning of the Second Gulf War, there was a period where everyone knew it was going to happen, but it hadn't happened yet. You may recall there was a period where the United States were talking about to the UN, should we go to the UN or not? Should we get permission to go to Iraq and so on? Eventually they did. Everyone knew they were going to do that. And so the market had anticipated this in the volatility of various things. And so you could find that effect in the data. So the actual relationship between risk and volatility and the actual economy is not so clear. We've done another study which looks at just European economies mostly over the 20th century. And this is done using diagrams more than anything else. And here's the countries involved. The first are Germany, France, and Britain, who were the combatants in the First World War. And then look at data from various neighboring states, Belgium, Netherlands, Spain, Italy. And there are two neutral countries, Sweden and Switzerland. One of the things I'm going to look at in this part of the study is that to ask the question, does it pay off to be neutral? Any country can declare itself to be neutral at any time. Let's discuss what neutral means. A neutral country, you can, within the legal frameworks of the world nations, can be, there's a possibility of being neutral. If you're neutral, what you agree to do is not to participate in a positive or a negative way in any war. So you don't help people in the war, you don't hinder them in the war. So if your neighbors start fighting, you keep on trading with them at exactly the same levels as you were trading before the war. Not more, not less. You don't allow them to pass their troops through your country, but you can do other things for them. You can take messages for them and things. And so a neutral country just doesn't get itself involved in the war. Sounds a good deal. In Europe, there are two famous neutral countries, Switzerland and Sweden. Switzerland has been neutral since the 16th century, and Sweden since the 19th century, and have been not involved in wars since that period. If you're really committed to being neutral, you don't join any organization of states which is mutually supportive, like NATO. Because that means NATO says that if you're attacked, then you'll have to come, I'll come and help you, and if I'm attacked, you must come and help me. If you're a neutral country, you can't do that, and so you don't join these sort of pacts. Switzerland won't even join the United Nations, because they think it's sort of possibly too self-helping. Both Sweden and Switzerland are topographically difficult. Switzerland is very mountainous, and Sweden is very large and flat and swampy and lots of lakes and things, and quite difficult to get around. And they both have very good armies, expensive armies, and they spend a lot of money on defense. Actually, the proportion of their GDP spent on defense is quite high. It's not as high as many countries, but they're quite high. Machiavelli once said of Switzerland, Switzerland will never be captured because it's too expensive. And that's the point of Switzerland. You can invade Switzerland, but it's going to be very expensive to take it. Okay, so here's two countries which have been neutral for a long time and were neutral during World War I and World War II. The question we ask ourselves is, do they benefit economically from that position? And I'll show you some diagrams in a second. Between the two wars, other countries also became neutral. Ireland, Austria, Finland, and in 1939, the United States became neutral. Now, of those states, 3 of them got involved in the war. Finland was invaded by Russia, Austria was invaded by Germany, the United States was attacked by Japan. So being neutral is not a good defensive strategy. You've got to not really declaring you're neutral doesn't necessarily guarantee anything much in a war. You've got to be more than just being declared neutral. And since the war, all kinds of nations have declared neutrality, including India, for a period anyway. Okay, so what this little study has done is taking the economics figures from various national accounts in Europe, and particularly looked at Sweden and Switzerland. And we particularly looked at the World War II, World War I, and the period of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was, as you know, the period where the United States gave a lot of money to various European countries. Right, I think so. Aha. If you have very good eyesight, there are some very shaded areas, slightly shaded areas there, and there, and there. The first shaded area is World War I. The second one is World War II, and the third is the Marshall Plan. What this graph is the growth rate of gross national product per capita of the neutral countries, year by year, right from 1975 up to the end of the century. I'm not going to discuss it in much detail, but essentially the neutral countries did very poorly during World War I. They had big declines in growth rate of GDP, so their growth rates were negative. Thailand recently was discussing their growth rate dropping to 6% positive, it's up here somewhere. They were going down here negative 12. So being neutral didn't pay off in World War I. However, after World War I, their growth rate was positive and rather stable, except in the middle there where it became negative in the Great Depression. In World War II, the neutral countries had, on the whole, a positive growth rate. In fact, at the end of the war, were doing very well. And post-war, they remain a steady positive growth rate. So what you'd say about this graph is that the neutral countries, apart from this period in World War I, have maintained a fairly stable growth rate, which is at a positive rate. How about the combatants? Again, you can't see these shades very well, but there they are. They did not too badly in World War I. They had positive growth rates in World War I. Now, if you're fighting a war, you're not necessarily doing badly economically because you're producing things. You're producing guns and tanks and shells and all kinds of stuff. It's not good stuff, but you're producing it. So your growth rate can be okay if that's where you measure success. I'm not saying you should, but if you did, it kind of doesn't look that bad. But after the war, they got this huge fluctuation, huge lack of stability between the wars. And then in World War II, they in fact started okay, and then they went very negative towards the end, huge decline, minus 15% growth rate. Then came the Marshall Plan, and they've got nice high positive growth rates of upper middle of 8%, and they've stayed stable since. In fact, Germany and Japan, which are the combatants, had amongst the highest growth rates of any country in the world after the war. So they did fine compared to the neutrals, but only past the war. In comparison, the neighboring countries, this is the countries who were not direct combatants but were involved, had a bad First World War and a very bad Second World War because they were often occupied, and they also were rather more stable than the combatants. So the neighboring countries saw it in between the neutrals and the combatants. Let me show you one other way of viewing this data. This is of birth rates, not strictly an economic measure. And you can't see that too well, I'm sure. There are 3 plots on there. But you're young, you've got great eyes, so you can see it. Features are essentially that birth rates are declining through the century. That's true of all major economies anyway, through that century. During World War I, that's this first shading area, there are big declines in birth rate, particularly for the combatants. That's this bottom one. And there are declines somewhat for neutrals and somewhat for neighbors. Quite a lot for neighbors. Birth rate is a measure of the society being disrupted. Men are away from home, there are not so many births. And so birth rate goes down during the beginning of a war, during a war. And then, of course, immediately after war, there's the baby boom, which is just here. And so what we're saying is that the combatants had a particularly bad war in terms of birth rate, then they recovered afterwards. The recovery, the baby boom actually is a year late, because immediately in 1918, 1919, we had this worldwide influenza epidemic, where a huge number of people died, including Europe, and so that had bad effects on everything. Then into wars, between the wars, the things just kept on declining. In World War II, there's very little disruption to birth rates. World War II did not affect families anywhere near as much as World War I. In Germany there was more effect, but in France and in Britain, the men were not away from the family anywhere near as much. There was some, but not so, in the same ratio as in the First World War. And in fact, the neutrals we can't see so much, but the neutrals actually have an increase in birth rate during the World War II. I assume there's some immigration going on into Sweden and Switzerland during World War II. That produced the extra birth rate. So birth rate has quite pattern than in World War II than in World War I. And it just shows that these, you can call these both complete wars, they in fact are quite different in nature. I want to say a little bit about the difference between post-World War I and post-World War II. And this is sort of a little history lesson, which I think most of you will be not so interested in, but it's not unimportant. A second. So we're looking at the situation with Germany at the end of 1919. Now, there had been a war between Germany and France back in 1880 or 1870, I don't know which, in which Germany had beaten France. And the conclusion of that war, Germany had got reparations from France. They'd asked France to help pay for the war. They'd taken various pieces of land from France, or pieces of land had changed hands, I don't know how you phrase it. And also Germany made France pay a large fine for losing the war. At the end of World War I, the French decided that's a good time to get revenge for the losses of the previous war. And Germany and the United States, who were also the victors, also agreed that Germany should pay for World War I. There's nothing about who was responsible for it. That would be almost impossible to work out. But having won it, it's clear who should pay for it. It's not the victors pay for it, the losers pay for it. And so they decided to put on huge fines to Germany. And for example, you must remember that in 1919, at that time, oil was not an important commodity. You didn't do much with oil. Coal was a big important commodity. You run your industry on coal and your transportation on coal, trains, and ships run on coal. So you measured energy through coal use, not oil use, as you would now. So the victors required that Germany release Austria and Poland, give back areas called Alsace and Lorraine to France, and also give the Saar region to France. These were all important industrial and coal-producing regions. They also produced some number of fines in terms of coal deliveries. In the end, they left Germany with only 50% of its pre-war coal production. So with that 50%, they're supposed to run the whole industry and heat their house and everything. There's also a monetary fine of $20 billion US 1920 dollars. Not sure I ever paid, but there was a fine of some huge amount allocated. Now, Keynes, in a very eloquent and heart-rending book, explained to the victors they shouldn't do that because it would disrupt not only the German economy, but all the economies that interact with Germany. It would disrupt the economies of all of Europe. And they should be much more gentle and careful with this and not make these fines so big. And Lenin said there's going to be a hyperinflation in Germany from these fines, and Keynes agreed. What in fact actually happened, the fines were made, Germany's economy suffered terribly. We got hyperinflation in Germany, which anyone will know about whoever collected stamps. You got the big recession, you got the rise of Hitler, which could be relayed back to the hyperinflation and so on. So you could say that the big troubles of the economy in Europe was due partly to the attitude of the politicians at the end of World War I. End of World War II, first of all, the victors were not talking about making Germany pay for the war. And then the Americans came forward with the Marshall Plan, which gave quite large sums of money to all the countries involved in the war, both winners and losers. So Britain got money, Germany got money, Japan got money, and so on. And the result was that the economy of Europe boomed after World War II. So it's quite clear that if you want to have a stable economy, you behave very sensibly after a war. I mean, this is such a clear-cut historical analogy or lesson. Okay, I'm going to talk about economics of terrorism quickly. This is not my topic at all, so I'm just going to mention it in passing. There's now very substantial literature on the economics of terrorism. For example, the Economic Journal of Political Economics in June of this year had a special issue on the topic. In the period 1968 to 2001, there were roughly 12,000 terrorist events globally, in which roughly 20,000 people were killed and 50,000 wounded. That is a substantial loss of life and people being wounded. But put that in context. Every year in the United States, there are 40,000 people killed on the roads. Okay, so 20 years of terrorist attacks equals half the people killed in a typical year in the United States on the roads. And yet, if you look at the newspapers in the United States, every terrorist attack is going to have a whole page, discussion on the front page, but there's never any discussion on the number of people killed on the roads. And when the annual figures come out, they say, oh, another 40,000 killed this year. And it's on page 73 or something. So terrorism is a very difficult problem, but you have to put it in some sort of context. The economic effects of these terrorist attacks are very local. So the particular place that is attacked is, of course, badly affected. Certain industries are very badly affected: the travel industry, shipping, airlines, trucking. But typically, in the whole scene of the economy, these attacks do not have much effect. It's like, if you look at the figures for, say, a big earthquake or big hurricanes in Florida, or other natural disaster in many countries, they are horrific. They don't have much effect on the economy. They might affect the growth rate by 1% something, but they're not really much. And most terrorist attacks, excluding nuclear at the moment, are just psychologically horrible. I'm not in any way defending them, but economically they're not quite so important. Excuse me. Now, to make thinking about what to do about economics and peace, this nice little quotation I got from a newspaper in San Diego. It was at a conference in San Diego, which I never was invited to. And the statement was, we have to make peace as profitable as war. And well, that's meaning is that people are worried that war is too profitable. Too many people benefit economically from a war, and that's why wars occur. If we could reduce the probability of war, or if we could increase the probability of peace, we would have more peace and less war. Now, wars, of course, don't occur for economic reasons, really. They occur more for political reasons. But nevertheless, this is something we could think about. There was a book called Report from Iron Mountain, 1967, which discussed how you could get the government to spend more money in peacetime, in that way generate things that would make the peace more profitable. But that book turned out to be a hoax. But it did generate a lot of discussion. I won't go through it. Lost one sheet, a second. Well, okay. I have a sheet which says that the amount of money spent on the military in the United States is not decreasing through time, but is decreasing as a percent of production in the United States. And so the United States is spending a huge amount of money on military every year. It spends as much money as the top 30 other countries in the world who spend money on military. Enormous amount. But that amount of money is decreasing in terms of percent of GDP. And so it's looking cheaper and cheaper to the United States what it's spending on military. And related to that is this table of the cost of US wars. And this comes from a organization who spent a lot of effort getting data on the cost of wars. These costs ignore the costs of deaths and wounded. And you can do an accounting of the value of a death or accounting of a person being wounded. This is purely the physical costs of buying armament and buying gasoline and stuff. And these are all in 2002 dollars. And so this first column is the cost of the war in billions of dollars. This is the cost per person in dollars. And finally, the cost of the war as percent of annual GDP. And so, without spending time on all the details, we go through the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the First Gulf War, and the Second Gulf War. And what we see is that the cost of the war in billions is actually all over the place, but still pretty big. This should be a bit bigger than that probably now. The per capita cost is going down. But of course, World War I and World War II are complete wars, and they're very expensive. These other ones are partial wars. But the cost of percent of GDP is getting into almost round-off error, negligible. You can run a whole Gulf War for 1% of GDP, 2% of GDP. What that means is that a US politician can discuss having a war of the size of the Gulf War and not be constrained by cost. You can be constrained by other things like morality and popularity and other things. That's something different. But cost is not so important anymore. And that's very concerning. Because although 150 billion is a lot of money, it's not much concerning that, and $600 per person is not that much money. Though if you told people that, I think they'd be quite worried about it. Now, it's interesting to know what to do about that. And these are all measured in terms of gross national product or gross domestic product. And these are measures of the wealth of a country. And I would describe that as a Western measure of happiness. You know, in the West, you think of the more money you get, the happier you are, automatically. And that's an idea which is not necessarily shared by most other people in the world. Many other people in the world, anyway. And I think one thing the economists are starting to think about now is alternative measures of well-being. And this is a topic which is a big topic, but is in a very early stage of development. How do you know whether or not someone is better off or worse off today than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Or how do you know someone is better off in one country than another country? The typical person or something. And that's a very difficult question. Measuring the amount of money they get is one way to do it, but it's not a perfect way of doing it. People are trying other ways to do it and just define what is happiness. And one way to do it is to do surveys. And you can do a survey of so-called consumer sentiment and ask how happy or how happy do you feel? Do you feel better off today than you were 2 years ago or something? And some of those surveys are quite useful, but not so easy to go across countries. And people have sort of short memories sometimes. They don't remember quite how well they were off 10 years ago. And you're older anyway, you have a different perception. There is a different way to proceed. It's called contingent valuation theory. What you do then is you ask people questions about how much you'd pay for something. And for example, supposing that the government was considering putting a very nice park at the end of your area, but it would be quite expensive. The question is, how much would the people in this area pay for having that park there? And what you could do is you go and do a survey of people in the area and do it the following way. You would randomly select a group of people to go ask questions of. Some group you'd ask the question, would you pay extra $25 a year taxes for the park? Another group you'd ask, would you pay $50 extra a year taxes? Another group you'd ask $75 a year, and another group $100 a year, and so on. And for each group, you work out what proportion said yes. You get a listing of the proportion who say yes for each different tax amount. You get some feeling for the amount of feeling towards the value of that park. Okay, so this was a survey done, an example of this, in 2001 in the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty. And they asked people in the States, how much tax increase would you pay for reduction in gun violence? It was phrased much more subtly than that, but that was the gist of it. And what they found was that 82% were willing to pay $25 extra a year taxes, 69% will pay $100 a year taxes, and so on. So there was quite a willingness to pay extra taxes. In the United States, people hate states to pay taxes, so this is quite surprising. But they also hate gun violence. So you could get a lot of people who are willing to pay taxes to get gun violence down. With 100 million households in the United States, these paid $100 extra. That would raise $10 billion a year to combat gun violence. If you got even half that, you could buy up every gun manufacturer in the world and just stop them down. I mean, you could do a lot to get guns off the roads with $10 billion a year. That's an evidence of the feeling towards people hating gun violence. We could do the same thing with peace. We have to learn how to phrase the right question to different people. How much would you be willing to pay in taxes to have peace for another 2 years or whatever? And we get a feeling, because people think they might have to pay this amount of money to get peace. Now, what you do with the money, that's another question. That's up to you to decide. And we will get a feeling from different countries of how much they're willing to pay for peace. And if you raise any sort of money, you would have stacks of money to pay off manufacturers of armaments and shut them down or whatever. You can do all kinds of things. I'm not saying this is a solution to things. I'm just saying that this is a way of finding out fairly cheaply, because surveys don't cost much, that the strength of feeling across countries and through time and different age groups and different regions, the feelings towards peace. I'm going to finish with just a quotation. If I can find it. There's a famous book called The Art of War by Sun Tzu, which is now 2,500 years old. I think there should be a book called The Art of Peace, too. And in the preface to that book, published in 1980, a very famous novelist called James Clavell wrote, "In war we prepare for peace, in peace we prepare for war." And I think we should now change that in peace we should prepare for continued peace. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Thank you, Professor Clive. Now we have some time left for the audience to pose any questions you may have to our Professor Clive Granger today. Ladies and gentlemen, please approach the microphone. We already have it there in the middle section. And also some of our students are carrying some wireless microphone. State your name, please, and also the organizations you represent. Thank you.
My name is Andrew Criswell. I'm in the graduate school at Bangkok University, and I have a question for. In your paper, you stated economists should make the general population aware of the full economic costs plus the possible benefits of war. Do you feel the economics profession was silent in voicing concern regarding the buildup of war with Iraq between the summer of 2002 and the spring of 2003?
Now, I don't signal off any group for doing that. I think the economists are not asking the question about benefits and costs properly. I mean, if every group understood what the costs are going to be, and of course there could be some benefits too, I'm not saying there aren't some benefits, then every group should be aware of what those are. In the discussion that went on, we never discussed the economics of the situation at all. We always discussed rights and wrongs and politics and psychology.
I guess the one exception to that is Paul Krugman. In
Yes.
a number of his editorials in the New York Times, he voiced concerns about the economics of the cost of the war in Iraq and the continuing cost.
Oh, but that was the cost of war, not the benefits from peace.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi. Sorry. David Owen from the University of Maryland here in Bangkok. By the way, I enjoyed your adage on the history aspect of your presentation.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you a question. From a political aspect, when you look at the realist school of thought and the liberalist school of thought, and we see that the realists considered the Cold War, this act of deterrence, to be a state of perpetual peace. And then after the end of the Cold War, and especially since the post-9/11 era, the unipolar, the multipolar environments have been in a state of chaos or not peace. Whereas the liberalists view the Cold War as more of a state of flux or chaos. I'm curious, which school would you categorize your perspectives in?
I view the Cold War as a war of high tension, because we're always worried about someone throwing nuclear bombs around. And once we got over that and managed to dismantle things, I think we were in a more stable situation. We went from one situation which was highly risky to a lower equilibrium which was somewhat less risky. Is that what you meant?
Well, I don't know. I kind of view the unilateral, the unipolar, multipolar environments since the post-Cold War to be quite sporadic, to be focused not so much on peace itself, but more so on the perpetuation of conflict. Whereas the Cold War seemed to me to be, looking back, it seemed to be relatively a peaceful world environment.
Well, it was certainly the case where both sides were scared to have a war because of the consequence of throwing nuclear bombs at each other. But that's not necessarily that's a very high risk era to be in. I think you couldn't want to make too many long run decisions on that. I didn't find that at all a comfortable period to live through. I'm finding the present period, until recently, more comfortable. The last 2 years I don't find comfortable at all with the terrorism attacks.
So do you think since post 9/11 there's a chance at global peace, so to speak?
I think we've had bad action and reaction in that situation. I mean, understandable to some extent. Not the way it's been done, but understandable in psychological terms. I think that the world's in a much worse situation now than we were 3 years ago. To the peace.
Thank you very much.
Hello. You said in your lecture that at the end of World War I, it was clear that the loser would have to pay for the war, that Germany would have to pay for what happened, and that had various predictable effects through Europe and around the world. Do you think that is what's happening right now in Iraq and the current situation? Is there any parallel between the two?
Not really, because in Iraq, everyone wants to help solve the problem. They're not extracting value from Iraq. I mean, they're going to use the oil, but that's different. They're going to buy the oil. I don't think there's any economic payback being requested from Iraq from this war. On the whole, people are quite anxious to get the whole thing put behind them as a problem, and giving money and help all kinds of ways.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, I'm Somkiat Tankitwanit from the Thailand Development Research Institute. You have talked about the way that people value peace quite a lot in the case of gun control alone. It's worth at least 10 billion if I recall correctly from your presentation. I think cost-benefit analysis may not be sufficient as a tool for us to prevent war and promote peace, because I think institution really matters in this case, because in this case, even though people value peace, peace is widely distributed. Why the cost? The cost of war is widely distributed to the whole society, but the benefit is usually concentrated in a number of interest groups, especially those dealing with weapons industries.
Yes.
So my question is, can the science of economics provide or shed some light into the way that we design institution to prevent war? For example, would it be sensible to have some provision in the constitution that before going to war in any country, you need to have some kind of referendum or that sort of thing? Thank you.
Yeah, I agree that cost benefit is not sufficient by itself as a procedure. I mean, I really want to have some numbers out there for people to discuss. And these should be not overall numbers, but detailed numbers about different industries, different regions, whatever, who's going to benefit, who's not going to benefit. I think that, I don't know what the right answer to your other question is, because there are certain circumstances you have to take action rather quickly. You can think of cases where you're going to have to leave it to the president, whoever, prime minister, to take quick action to put in a circumstance. And take a referendum just takes too long. On the whole, I like the idea of having a referendum and full, complete discussion and so on. I'm not quite sure a referendum is quite the right way to do it. A bigger body than just a single person or just a cabinet is better. I think that in terms of the industry, I'd rather see in legislation which says that there has to be maximum profits you can earn from a war, or even possibly nationalization of certain industries in a complete war anyway. And that happened in World War II, for example, that Britain nationalized various companies who were involved in trucks and airplanes and things to make sure that the profits were not too excessive.
Or perhaps what about certain kinds of global institutions, like, for example, if we treat war as a tort against other countries, as in the civil law. A step forward to have some kind of global institution to provide this incentive for war.
I mean, I'm in favor of that as a basic idea, but actually doing it's going to be very difficult. I mean, who actually is on that committee that decides on what, who does what, and so on? The United Nations is an example of a really great idea which doesn't work so well because it's getting too numerous. I mean, it's very difficult to actually run some of these basically good ideas in practice.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Sukum from Faculty of Economics, Thammasat University. I would like to ask you whether in the past election, the American public seemed to reflect a different view with the 10 Nobel laureates in economics, where they strongly oppose George Bush But eventually, George Bush was elected anyway. So I wonder if American public was more in favor of non-peace action against the world affair, or the economists have not really reflected the true feeling of the Americans. Thank you.
I think the second. I think the Nobel laureates are not typical members of the American public. It's clear that the American public are still very cross about September the 11th and want to get back at that. And they feel that Bush is doing something about that. I'm not agreeing with that, but I think that's their feeling. And they're still worried, they were worried about further terrorist attacks and have the feeling, rightly or wrongly, that Bush could handle terrorists better than Kerry. I mean, I don't know where they got that from, but that was the apparent feeling. But it was very marginal, as you know, the victory was pretty close anyway, so I can't rationalize that decision.
So the laureates did not oppose Bush on the military ground or on economics?
They did oppose Bush strongly, yes. I mean, there was a letter, laureates were asked to sign a letter about who to vote for and about the war. And most of us, I couldn't sign because I'm not an American citizen, but the American citizens signed a letter in favor of Kerry. Not all of them, but many of them.
Do we have any more questions? Thank you.
Hi, Professor. My name is Sopon Techasiwalai. I'm just a freelance writer. I have one question about economics. From your lecture, it seems like the defense budget is just a meager sum compared to GDP. But during the past 20 years, the supply side economists always use the defense budget or the cost of war as a justifier for the government deficit, especially in the U.S. Even, for example, like the last record deficit that George W. Bush has run through, and he blamed it practically on preventive terrorist attack and war at Iraq. So what's your opinion of that, Professor?
I mean, the expense of defense and homeland security is substantial. And it has, it's been one of the contributions to the big budget deficit. The major contribution actually has been the tax rebates from Bush. It's still true that all these components are small compared to the full budget. And it's also true that the budget deficit, which is huge, is still quite small compared to the total US GDP. And so whereas 10 years ago, that would not have been true. And the US has just grown steadily over the last 2 decades, and now it's enormous. And I think people are not keeping the eye on that aspect of the United States.
Yes, do we have any more questions? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor Granger. Good to see you here today. I'm Dr. Paul, graduate school, Bangkok University. I'm not an economist, I'm a marketer by trade. But could I take you back to the question you raised in your paper, can economies deliver peace? The first comment I would like to make is that surely it's only people who can deliver peace, not economies. It would appear to me that the economics of peace relate more to social re-engineering, and that as a consequence of good social re-engineering, peace is delivered. So my question to you is this: what economic principles would you suggest are useful to consider in order to attempt to reassure a country like Thailand that social re-engineering will eventually create peace?
I think we can't guarantee peace anywhere. One of the things that's interested me in this trip is how people have linked the income distribution with peace, whereas that link has not occurred anywhere else that I've discussed this matter. So I find that fascinating and an important idea. In most countries, or most people I've discussed it with, the fact that there are poor people doesn't affect the thinking about peace. I'm very sympathetic to the lower part of the income distribution, but I think that the decisions about going to war, I'm not sure I want to say this quite right, but let's say it this way, are not much affected by the poor people. It's affected by the politicians who are then themselves possibly affected by a few people who make very big profits from war. I'm talking more about the United States than anywhere else. I think that's not so true in other places, but possibly it is. And so what I was thinking about in that quote you made, of somehow breaking that link between making war profitable to a small group of the population and wars occurring. I think we've got to get that link broken. It's certainly there in the United States, but I'm not sure we can prove it, but it's certainly there.
Yes, please approach the microphone, thank you.
Another Farang. I'm Peter Waugh from the Australian National University, Professor Granger. Thank you very much for your talk, and thank you to the International Peace Foundation and Bangkok University for organising this event. You began by saying that you assume that most people want peace and not war. And then you pointed out that there's always a group in the society that can profit from war. That is, arms manufacturers and maybe some people in the military. And I thought at that point, oh, well, then the answer is to make war less profitable by announcing during peacetime some system of taxation that would be implemented during war to stop those people from making lots of money. But then as your talk went on, I thought, no, that really couldn't be the most important point. Surely the most important point is that during the prelude to war, attitudes change. And the public, and the United States example that you've just talked about illustrates it. Public attitudes change. If you were to do a contingent evaluation, if you were to have done one before the Iraq War and ask people, how much tax would you be willing to pay to hurt Saddam Hussein, get him out of office? Or how much tax would you be willing to pay to find a way to strike at Al-Qaeda if you could only find out where they were? That sort of thing. During the prelude to war, people would be willing to pay a lot.
Right.
So isn't that the problem? Is it really that there are people who profit from war, arms manufacturers, or is it that public attitudes change so that people actually want war? And government, in acting through war, is merely responding to a change in public attitude. It's the change in public attitude that's the problem.
Okay.
Question.
Let me make a few points to that. I think attitudes do change. In the United States, people didn't care about Hussein very much. They wanted to get revenge on September 11th, certainly. They didn't know who to hit. They wanted to hit somebody. And he was a possibility. But I think that war was never very popular. So what was your last point? I have a response to that. Yes. I think that the public view towards partial wars is quite different to the attitude to a complete war. I mean, in 1939, the public would certainly have gone to war. I mean, no question about it. They were very definite about the Second World War being a correct one, not necessarily the timing, but doing it. I doubt whether the same thing was true of the First World War. I wasn't there then. But I doubt whether that was such a clear-cut war. Clearly after Pearl Harbor, the Americans would have dearly loved to go into war with Japan. I mean, that was never a question. So the question is not, it depends on the war, depends on the situation. I think you're right that attitudes do change just up to the war as opposed to somewhere before it. But it does depend on the type of war you're talking about and how distant it is from a home base. It's much easier to vote for a war in Afghanistan, which you know is going to have no effect on almost anybody you know, unless they happen to be a sergeant in the army. That is for a war which is going to affect everybody immediately. And so we have to phrase these questions very carefully on this contingent evaluation, I suspect. Is that?
Yeah, my name's Alan Oliver. I'm with the World Buddhist University. You seem to imply in your talk, you got close to the word gross national happiness, and the King of Bhutan is pushing this concept, and they're having conferences now. The next one will be in Canada. What do you see as the potential for using the economic terms and forms with the peace issue? And I'm thinking of the environmental movement, who now they're talking about carbon units, trading carbon units.
Right.
Is there a way to have peace units that we trade, and the United States would have to pay a peace tax because they went to war?
Sure.
It was the potential for this economic forms being used in the peace issue.
I mean, that's a long way down the road. We're so far from having a way of measuring these attitudes towards peace or towards happiness. But yeah, sure, anything's possible. Once you get a proper measurement, you can do it. It'd be great.
I'm Sachala Naranang from the International School of Bangkok. I'd like to ask a general topic which is, I think is very relevant to the question, do economies deliver peace or prevent war, but has not been directly addressed in your lecture. Sometimes economic sanctions are characterized as a tool for preventing war, as in the case of Iraq. How would this fit into your model? And would economic sanctions be a feasible or justifiable tool for preserving peace?
Good question. I never thought about it. Sanctions that worked could have a good, be interesting procedure for doing it. I don't know of any sanctions that have worked properly yet. They've always leaked a bit. But yeah, I think sanctions are one of the many tools we could use. But I have never thought about the question, so I have no answer. Thank you for the question.
So how would you characterize sanctions that did work properly?
I don't know of any that did work. I mean, they all seem to leak. The countries that were being sanctioned always kept on going fine. Managed to bribe enough people to deliver the oil or something, whatever they were being sanctioned about. I mean, Iraq was fine. South Africa was fine for a period, whatever. The sanctions don't seem to be worked well enough.
Thank you.
Yes, we have some more questions here.
Virod Naranong from Thailand Development Research Institute. You mentioned terrorism only in passing, but when you say that we should not justify a war on the economic ground, I think we should not justify, we should not downplay terrorism by just on the low head count. I think for many people that have terrorism in their backyard, it's like a small war going on, and for the terrorist itself, terrorism is something like a small guy could make his or her own war and disrupt a lot of life in maybe in small region, and you never feel it unless it's in your backyard, like the 9/11 events. So I'm not sure how should we look at it, but if a small guy could make a small war all over the world, I think it's something that we should not ignore. It might have little effect on the economy as a whole, on the whole economy, but it could have a very big effect in a small region like in the south of Thailand right now, and also maybe in certain area.
Sure. No, I mean, I'm not saying terrorism is not very important. Terrorism is extremely important. My categorization of wars was just too crude. There may be many different categories of war, and partial war can be of many different types, including terrorism, which there's many of them. I mean, clearly the Palestinian-Israeli is not really a terrorist war, it's a war. That's much, we're getting into subtlety, that's not my area at all. Absolutely, I think that anything involving loss of life and loss of property is important. Just like in 40 minutes you can't deal with everything.
Thank you.
Professor Clive Granger, thank you very much for your statement. My name is Wan Hee Lee. I work with the United Nations, with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I found much of what you said very interesting. Particularly at the very end, you seem to be, presenting as one possibility an old idea that unfortunately was, I think, discredited too easily, something like the Tobin tax. If we're all benefiting from the services of mail delivery, if we're all benefiting from airlines, things that work well in peacetime, are we willing to pay a little bit more to ensure that there is peacetime for these things to operate smoothly? And I believe you're correct in saying that we don't have enough opportunities to actually express that desire. I do think that many people would be actually willing to pay a cent more on every mail that they send, or $1 more for every airline ticket that they buy, in order to build peace, to strengthen peace. And in fact, your question as to where they would go, there are many possible channels where these kinds of funds could go to, but I think that strengthening the international institutions that preserve peace would be a worthwhile investment. My question to you is whether you are advocating for the return of this idea, for re-examining again the reasons why they were discredited back then, and to be helping governments, but more helping people through events like this to reconsider the idea, but this time much more forcefully and maybe persuasively than before. Thank you.
Since the previous era, the ways to ask the questions in what have improved a lot. And I think that there's now been a lot of evaluation of these methods, and they seem to work a lot better now they've learned how to do it properly. And so they now have better standing than they did, say, 5 years ago. And so I'm hoping that that's one reason that they may be accepted now and not earlier. I have the feeling at the moment that you'll sell it easier if the tax money went just to the nation that is raising the taxes, not for international things. But part of it could certainly go to international things. That has to be debated entirely by the people involved, though. I mean, I don't know enough about what's the appropriate way to spend that money, if there is any money. But that's something that would be fun to talk about.
One more question.
Professor.
Thank you.
Hello. Professor, you covered some historical aspects in your lecture, but if you go further back in history, starting with the Roman Empire and especially through the Middle Ages, one could argue that basic economic systems were built on going to war. Free market economy and later the socialist economic systems. Would it be possible, my question is, would it be possible to create a fundamentally different new economic system that was a peace economy? Maybe it's the basic economic systems from the past that are flawed, that are
Yeah.
structured towards war, basically, or danger of some sort.
I think that, I mean, I love it, and I read a lot of it, but I think that the economies way back are so different from our present economy that they throw no light on us. The wars are mostly about land or about who's going to be king of something or other, and purely economics of that individual or family or something, or one country wanting to take over another country to expand and so on. That's not the way, we don't on the whole fight wars about land currently. People, when they win a war, just don't stay there, particularly. So I think that the economies are so different, the attitudes are different now. Fortunately, the British and the French and the Portuguese and so on aren't out there conquering half the world and redrawing the maps. That's all crazy. So I don't think we can learn too much about what's happening now from the distant past.
Thank you.
Thank you. As we are pressed with time, do we have any more questions from the audience? If not, I would like to thank all the participants for their time today. And lastly, I would also like to invite Dr. Thanu Gulachon to be on stage again, please, to present the token of appreciation to our Professor Clive Granger.
Thank you. Thank you. That's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you. Bit heavy? No, it's nice.
And
Thank you very
also,
much.
please, Mr. Uwe Morawetz, the chairman of International Peace Foundation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Once again, on behalf of Bangkok University, we would like to extend our sincere thanks to all the participants who have spent this afternoon with us. Have a safe journey home. Thank you. Please, in front of the stage, please, with Professor Clive Granger.